Welcome to another meeting of the Fun Soupe Society, where of course our current project is either to free James Brown or else let's exhume once more Mozart and see if he is actually hiding Haydn's head. But notwithstanding that, I thought since we were already in the summer that I would give you your summertime gift, but what I had in mind was so potentially that I hesitate, to say the least, to start the tape with it, because that would probably be the end of tonight's tape. So here's what we'll do. Somewhere I was going to talk about a few other things, so I'm going to have to do them first. I can't do the gift for you first, or it's just all over with for the night, and maybe then some. So I'll do the others first, and then what I'll do is when I get through with that and it gets to be the gift, we'll pretend that that was the end of tonight's tape. And we'll cut off the tape, and I'll go change clothes or something, or put on a different toupee and come back. And we'll start like it's another one, and then I'll start off and give you the gift right off the bat. But see, then that will not have killed you from hearing what I was going to start with tonight, or at least the sound waves will be in the room whether you hear it or not. So here we go. Here's the taping for tonight. So we'll play like we're just starting. So forget all that about Fun Soupe and all that, because he forgot about us. I was going to mention as a springboard again parts of what would seem to be history, I guess, except I'd like to remind you that there are two kinds of history, remember, backward and forward. And even when I'm apparently talking about backward history, because it is difficult verbally to talk about forward history. Although I do it, I just don't call it that. But remember, backward history is literally of no consequence. So remember that, because I'm going to talk about, as a basis, I'm going to start with such things as the development and then the abandonment of cities and the Dark Ages and the Renaissance and the development of heavy industries, all those interesting subjects. So remember that literally it means nothing. Now you can read history, you can be interested in history, it's a fine hobby. But surely, some of you suspect that history, backward history, is meaningless. It's just a hobby. So here we go. I was going to point out, as in the beginning, that what would appear to be man's evolutionary history could be looked at as being synonymous with the history of cities. And for those of you just seeing the tapes for the first time, or the second or third or 17th time at some other time in some other place, when I say cities, I could be saying state. And as far as you know, I could be talking about out there the history of the development of cities. But if that's all you think I'm talking about, Jesus Christ. Fun Soupe had you in mind with some of his ditties, and I won't tell you which ones. So remember that regardless of how we all hate it, I could inadvertently, inescapably be talking metaphorically sometimes. I don't do it on purpose, that's for sure, but remember, the evolution of man could be seen as being synonymous with the evolution of cities, but you've got to understand what cities represent. See, there you are, it's almost a metaphor. Cities don't just represent something, cities are fucking something, right? Maybe. They're a collection of diverse, to say the least, even conflicting interests, ideas, energies, powers, smells, cultures, languages. What is a city other than that? You could look at also all aspects of mortal culture, everything. Religion, art, literature, banking, bowling, romantic love, all of this. All of these are direct products of city life. They could not have come about otherwise. It would have to be in that kind of necessary mixture of diverse, even conflicting, to say the least, possibilities, ideas, energies, peoples. The varying genetic structures running through life and manifesting itself in men. Now, still playing around with the apparent material basis of backward history, you could look at what is generally referred to in the Western world as the Dark Ages. You could look at it in a certain way that does not, in fact, conflict with the general picture of assumed history back at the old world level. I'm just going to put a certain spin on it for you, and of course probably be unable to resist somewhere along the line to point out to you that if all of this were true, if all this did happen apparently outernally, it's internally that matters. But you could look upon that era known as the Dark Ages very specifically as being all the way from abandonment to, well, all the way from destruction in some of the reported cases, to the abandonment of city life. And that you had the people in the Western world literally going back to the more solitary, isolated, pastoral life. And it is referred to after the fact as the Dark Ages. It is synonymous with, well, let me make it simple. History is not the point, as you should know, but like the downfall, as they call it, the final destruction. The Vandals had their fun. The Roman Empire went. Generally speaking, a rough outline of history would then say in the Western world that civilization ground to a halt and in fact retrogressed. People left the cities. They just walked away from them. Those that hadn't already been destroyed, and that the Vandals and the Goths and the pro-von Sufi societies, that they didn't go in and just wreck the cities. They became wrecked through abandonment. It was like people just went, phooey on this, for whatever reason. It's like they just wandered off, and by some views, turned their back on 2,500 years worth of Western civilized evolution. But they went back and left the small city-states, the large city-states, the large scope of city life, and as though everybody just went back, if not absolutely solitary, just individuals, which of course they didn't because people did mate, but it was almost back to that solitary existence of not much more than blood kin. In many cases even smaller than tribal life. That just people sort of went, and split up and went back to that kind of near solitary, isolated, pastoral, non-city existence. Then you could look, still apparently talking about old world, outernally history. Then comes, after that, the Renaissance. We'll skip all this Middle Ages crap and late Dark Ages and all that. The Renaissance. And you could see the Renaissance as being, again, synonymous with an action. And the action in this case was the return to city life. That was the Renaissance. You can peel it all kinds of ways you want to, and I'm sure that there's been many people that have gotten their PhDs coming up with new intellectual views of what the Renaissance was. But I can tell you this, the Renaissance was definitely this. It was a return of all these people, and of course their offsprings, but all these people apparently, almost suddenly, deciding, hey, let's all move back into the cities, or let's start some cities, let's all move in together. It's as though they not only decided to collect themselves back in groups, large groups, not just family groups, not just tribal groups, not just second and third generation blood kin, but diverse peoples that just suddenly, you know what suddenly means by now, who knows what it means in the horizontal world. But groups got together with different languages. They've been living out in different parts of Europe. And it's like they just began to suddenly stumble along and come to where these trails meet, and people that had been living in isolation, people that had been at odds with one another when they thought of each other, if they run across each other individually. Here they were of different languages, cultures that had been split up there for hundreds of years. Then it was as though something magnetically happened and was pulling these diverse, even conflicting groups back together. And so then they got into towns and something else happened when they got back into a city life situation. It was also as though, not completely because this is not a linear world, and so it didn't all happen at once, but it was as though also at that period was in a form a kind of turning one's back on the power that the church had had in the Western world, that is, of the afterlife being the whole point of being alive, and going back to city life, the so-called Renaissance. But going back into a collective city life, it was as though people then began to sort of turn their back. Of course they didn't. The church had power for years and years and years and still has power. I know all that. But what was recognized after the fact as being a kind of rebirth was parts of life's body manifested in some peoples, enough that made history, that apparently to some degree was turning their back on the idea that life sucks. I mean, here we are living out in mud holes, chewing on leather. You know, I only know this one woman I'm married to and all these little nippers I got here, and every now and then, once every 10 years, her mother shows up, which, you know, reminds me of an old piece of leather or something. Going from that kind of life, which if they had been exposed to the church, which they were, even those that weren't exposed, you got to understand the church had that same kind of influence that the genetics has in everyone, was the feeling that, yeah, life is terrible. And that's the whole point of the church and religion. And the afterlife is to make up for this. But then once they began to collect back into cities, even those were extremely diverse, even conflicting views, energies, etc., it was then as though many people began to turn their intellectual back on this afterlife, and the feeling was, well, hey, life ain't all that bad. Life may be something to live right now, and it might be possible for men, such as us, to be pleased by living this life. Now, some ways it's interpreted as that sort of attitude had to happen for men to then begin to pursue a new intellectual path. The literature reborn, the arts, science, and etc. The so-called in toto of the Western Renaissance. Now, may I direct your attention to the fact that as always, as far as it can be described, this has literally taken place. It did take place in the nervous system of humanity. It manifested itself more in some people than others. It is a direct manifestation of what is in you, if you can read it. It is the living history, and it transcends the description of real backward history, because it is still alive. It is the simultaneousness that I have pointed out, and some of you get continuing glimpses of, the reality, in other words, of what the Renaissance was. Instead of worrying about it happening from 1000 to 15, rather than it being a period apparently in the horizontal life of man, the line of time, it is still extant. It is still alive in you. Now, I can say, to make it simple, that it's still alive in everyone. All right? Very few people have the receiving mechanism, they're intellectually plugged in, that they can never feel the life of it. Now, I'm not talking theoretically. I don't mean that you sit down and read such an intriguing retelling of the Renaissance or any historical epoch that you say the writer just brings it alive. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about it is still alive. You are still undergoing some form of a Renaissance. You are still undergoing, it's there simultaneously, it has not passed, of a dark ages in you. It happens, I'm safe to say in many people, it happens the same thing on a daily basis, or it can happen within a daily 24-hour period, that you undergo the dark ages, that you abandon the city life, the higher life as far as it has gotten in you, and you retreat, and you run back. It may only take a split second, as though you run back into the dark, hoary bogs and woods of northern Germany, and you run back and you suck your thumb, You get mad and you think, boy, to hell with everybody else, I'll just be a hermit. Nobody loves me, nobody appreciates me, and I'll go find where Amadeus is buried and I'll lay down beside him and I'll teach him a lesson. You can do that, and then 30 seconds later, somebody comes by and says, boy, you're looking good. You go, ah, and you run back into the city, you open up all the shades, and you holler, life's all right, and it's a renaissance, continually, literally. I'm not just playing with words, this literally is still available. The reality of it is not come and gone. It apparently has come and gone out there. It has apparently come and gone to ordinary perception. But it has not come or gone, or I wouldn't keep bringing up these apparent historical aspects as even a springboard, even when I say they're metaphorical, even when they seem to you to be obviously metaphorical. See, that's where you're wrong, because they're not obviously metaphorical, they're not even metaphorical. I just have to say that, or else you would think, well, hell, it's a damn history lesson, and plus sometimes you don't even have all the dates exactly right. But see, that's why I have to tell you it's metaphorical. But now I'm telling you it's not metaphorical. The Renaissance happened, not the way they said it happened. And I'm not going to describe how it happened. If you can never perceive and tune into how it happened, you don't need me. It's in you. It's genetically in you, and it's not gone. It's a continuing process. The Dark Ages is not over. The first collection into city life is not over. The collection into city life was when you began to have a cortical language develop. It was when your brain began to operate, when you began to talk. Because before people talked, now apparently I'm talking about out here again, it's true. But it's not metaphorical, and it's not even correct. So remember that. People did not collect into cities until they could talk. Trust me. They did not. If we had a period where men did not talk, and I'm not giving you any more of a history lesson, I'm not even talking about prehistory now, because there was a time you didn't talk, so don't worry about history. Right? You understand? Don't worry about whether I'm talking about 10 million years ago, 40 years ago, 35 years ago, you couldn't talk, all right? So don't worry about whether I'm talking about 5 million years ago. But people, if men did exist, and they evolved and went through a process and developed language, the ordinary idea of evolution, if that was correct, they did not collect into city life until they could talk. Some of you should be able to just immediately realize that, yeah, they could not. Did not, could not, would not, will not, never not, won't not. Men, if we could still call them men, without a language, men not talking, which would be men not thinking, not collect into city life. They would naturally be isolated. They would naturally live in the pastoral environment. Thus, you have it that individually, until you have a language, until you are thinking, you have no, I'll say interest, but there is no possibility of you involving yourself in city life. Until you can talk, at least on a mortal level, you're not even part of your own family. Now, parents take care of their kids until they talk. And let's say the kids, it's obviously at that level that's less than the cortical level, the kid's already accustomed to its mother. Now, I don't mean through habit, it's genetics, but the kid likes to be there. But the kid is not really a part of the family in a mortal sense, in a human sense, in a civilized sense, until he talks. Then he has joined the city of at least the family. Then it's the mother and the father and the kid, and whatever other siblings there are. Then you have city life. Now let's take it even more specific. The brain. You're born in the brain, getting blood, getting oxygen. Electricity is getting to the brain. And what's going on? Think about the old stories as they like to tell them now or speculate, and I'm just bringing it up as a apparent metaphor. The great void, right after the Big Bang, or sometime between the Big Bang and last Tuesday. The great primordial soup and lightning and thunder and ammonia, little hydrogen here and there, little Jack Daniels, something floating around, and the thing was alive. The universe was alive, according to some of the astrological speculations now. It was alive the same way I'm describing. Lightning slicing through. The unpopulated universe is nothing but the materials of creation. Apparently, or at least semi-inert. and yet lightning keeps flashing. That is, the brain's getting oxygen's around, hydrogen's around, all the combinations around, and then suddenly, as the evolutionists would have it, it's almost as though a spark happened and life began. The brain, it's as though you were a void in the sense that there was no positive, meaningful, directed life. The brain is getting lightning flashes, it's got all the elements, but until the brain begins to talk, until the dialogue starts in you, you are the primordial soup. You are the universe without life. You are living outside the city. You don't even know any better. You couldn't get to the city if you wanted to. As soon as you start talking, you are now part of a city, if it's no more than your mother and your father, or wherever you are. You are now part of a city. You will, to some degree, and it could be, as I said, daily. It could be from moment to moment. You are going to go through a kind of process that has to do with an abandonment, a retreat from city life, a dark ages, a period of where, if it's just a moment, a minute, an hour, comes and goes, it doesn't matter, that you are attempting to live the solitary life of a pastoral hermit, that you're back living out in the bogs and down in the swamps and the lowlands over there, out by yourself. And then the Renaissance will happen, either because somebody smiled at you, as I said, or for no reason as far as you can tell. Just in spite of yourself, the next day you get up, and I'll be damned if I don't feel better. So there you are, you're back in at least a semi-Renaissance. You're back to where the brain is under city life conditions. As far as the hermits, in general, of me referring to it as that way, to what is ordinarily called the Dark Ages, there are still people who attempt to specifically, an individual, live a kind of life of isolation, all the way from being a literal hermit to somebody that just goes away and says, you know, later for everybody, no contact, no radio, no nothing, I'm just going out and it's me and myself. All the way from that to gradual variations, degrees of it. Now I want to point out, not just individually, which of course is still true, but even what appears to be historically. Hermits, those attempting to live, those that life is wired up to live, life of apparent self-selected isolation. They have served purposes apparently in history for such things as being prophets, being predictors, but the real prophet, spelled with a P-H-E-T, and if you'll follow it in a second, even F-I-T, both prophets always come from the city. In the middle of the sentence, I knew I was losing too many of you. I'll take responsibility. Think about in history. Think about those areas that seem to be singular, powerful. The so-called religious dramas that have happened in life. All of them, without me giving you a religious lesson, which I'm not any better prepared to do that than I am to talk about the Renaissance, or why Austria turned its back on Franz von Suppe right when he, well, never mind that. I don't want to make myself cry. Think about the religions. If you don't know enough and it doesn't strike you, all of the so-called great religious thinkers, or the great religious, the founders of religion, all that, all of them had some kind of a form of a hermit, some kind of somebody like Jesus had. What John of the Wilderness, or whatever his name was. But they all did, if you don't know it. They all had. If it wasn't just an individual, it was a collection of monks. It was a collection of erstwhile holy men before them, seekers of something, and they were always saying, voices in the wilderness. I think it's what the Old Testament referred to, the one I was trying to think of, John the Baptist. That these guys, whether it was an individual or some group, and it could have been over a period of time to where it was almost institutionalized hermetism, But it was always some group saying, we're not it, we're not it. Either some group or some guy. The secret, what we're all needing, we all need something, don't we? And some group there at their place, whether it's in India or the Middle East or the Far East, and some group of people, apparently that civilization right there would be going, yeah, yeah, yeah. And so this hermit, or these groups of hermits, whether literally hermits or semi-hermits, which of course they got to be non-literal or they wouldn't be talking to anybody. So, but they're saying things like, all right, we're waiting for something, we want something. And some group would go, yeah. The hermits have served purposes of being like predictors that will say, well, we're not it, but we know he's coming. We know he's coming. Now, I'm just telling you if you don't know it. The rule is those people are always in a form of being hermits, living pastoral lives. They had abandoned the city life, and they'd gone out. And they would come back and say, all right, we've gone out, we've starved ourselves, we've beat the bushes, we've got poison ivy up and down our private parts, we're bleeding, we're hungry, we're lonely, we're horny, nobody likes us, we stink, and we still hadn't found it, but we found out this. We're here to tell you this. What we've been looking for, and what many of the people you're interested in making the city, somebody knows this. People know it before, and somebody else knows it, and we know he's coming. We know he's coming. And so life has used those who have abandoned city life by and large, have used them as being kinds of dreamers and predictors. But when the big Yahoo does show up, he always comes from the city. Always. And some of you may have some kind of dream that some of those religious people were nice, bucolic lads that just simple, wandered in off the farm and the guy just spoke to them. You're wrong. Every one of them came from city life. Think about that a second. Those of you interested in this sort of activity, you have gone through that same kind of process. You had part of your own nervous system, part of your own genes of life itself, sang out like John the Baptist or like the monks that joined up with Buddha when he started wandering out of the city and went out in the woods. All of them. You had your own intellectual patterns, you had your own intellectual energies that acted as a kind of dreamer, as a kind of predictor, as a kind of John the Baptist, saying, I just know that there's something here. That is, it's wandering around its own brain. Of course, Buddha's out there wandering around in the forest. But you was running around your own brain just, I know something's here, I know something's here. Buddha's out there running around. Moses running around. Everybody was running around. Well, they say Confucius kind of moseyed more than run around, but I can't vouch for that. I guess for a laid-back dude, moseying is running around. But look, it happened in your own brain. I'm giving a fair description. That you were running around, perhaps from a very early age, running around trying to find what's going on here in life, what's going on. And it was as though it was a voice in the wilderness. You tried to check with your parents, you checked with priests, rabbis, smart people, teachers, your neighbors. And this thing almost went into its own dark ages. That is, it would almost run out of the city from that kind of conflicting, disturbing, multi-noisy life. And it's like it ran out, and it would run back into itself, though, and say, I know something's here, I know it's here, I know some kind of information's coming. It didn't necessarily say, I think a prophet is coming. There's some figure, but it was the same thing to the brain. The information, there's a secret, and it's coming. But what I'm thinking right now ain't it. And you were right. Because most people never get past that point. They kind of get past that point, to that point, if they're interested at all, and it's like, then the part of the dialogue that's playing, the voice in the wilderness, says, well, I can't find it, and I'm not it. And it's like the other part of the dialogue finally says, you're damn right you ain't it. And it's like both voices, one of the few times in their life that they do mutually agree. It's like both of them tacitly kind of look at each other and go, hell with it. And that's the end of it. Then you go and you take up bowling and you get married and you have your own kid. But it is a more primitive part. You should be better than me having to speak in nouns. It's not a part of the brain, it's a more primitive activity in your brain, because there's no particular part for it. It comes and it goes. But it was that part that would retreat from the confusion of city life. And I'm sure that some of you here and on tape, the kind of people that believe they're interested in this, I'm sure plenty of you tried being a hermit. You may not have called it that, but tried to join a commune or decide, I'm going to leave the city. I'm going to quit being an insurance adjuster and I'm going to go out and be a farmer. I'm going to do something righteous. I'm going to plant sweet potatoes, or I'm going to take up well digging. You were going through this same process, and you probably said, well, the people in the city, modern life, whatever circle it was for you, 1960s, 1970s, life is getting too far afield from the real values, some kind of spiritual trek of which I believe I am interested in. They are on the different course, and I'm going to leave it. I have no doubt that many of you weren't being silly. It's nothing to attack, it's nothing to feel guilt over. But at the time, I'm sure that many of you tried it to some degree physically. That you moved the organism itself, the body itself. But here's where it was happening. That primitive part, that more primitive part, undergoes a kind of continual retreat from the city life. And it wants to be solitary. It wants to go out and nurse its wounds. It wants to whine. It wants to worry. It wants to at least go, well, I don't know what's going on here. I just know that I'm hungry. I know that I'm irritated. I know that I'm curious. I know that I should be happier than I am. The prophet, the real prophet, let me use the religious terminology here for a second, of your more primitive activities of your own brain, you're kind of John the Baptist that went, hey, I'm not much. I can ask strong questions. I can beat the bushes and get people all upset. I can run into the city every now and then and holler, hey, all you people that's working, all you people that's got families, all you people that's doing the regular thing. They go, yeah. He says, are you happy? And they go, no. He goes, I told you. And he has to run for it. Because they want to holler, well, all right, you've pointed out the problem, what's the answer? And he doesn't know the answer. But he knows he can stir them up. He can make them go, wait a minute, do you know what the answer is? Do you know? That's the primitive activities of your own brain, and it sets it up. It is a kind of continual, as I'll say one more time, you should be able to follow this. It could happen on minute to minute, it could happen once a day, it could happen 4 times a day, it could happen once a week. As you retreat from that, ordinary people, ordinary intelligence, they believe it's still extant. It just has not shifted much at all in all these thousands of years. The belief that if there's a secret, it is going to come from the bushes. That is, it's going to come from more private areas, more primitive areas of life's nervous system, of my nervous system, of life out there. To wit, the same old story that if there is some great knowledge, if there is something to feed this hunger, if there's something to shut up the John the Baptist in me, the monks in me, they're out there starving themselves, kicking themselves around, trying to find the secret of life. If there's anything there, it's got to be out there in the bog. It's got to be outside of city life. You've already forgotten life. But it's hands up your jumpers and your knickers making you a blah, 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 and over here it's blah, blah, blah. And it's the same life doing it, and it's 2 different hands. That is, the information I want, the prophet I'm looking for. P-H-E-T and F-I-T. It's economic and it is religious. The real prophet is going to come from the city. The real prophet, what you're going to find, is going to come from the more complex part of your own nervous system. That is the only place that you can plug into where life is moving toward. Anything else is literally, as far as you can perceive it, backward history. You're picking up flawed accounts, not only of that which has happened, but that which still is happening, and you can't even perceive that it's still happening because you're trapped in it. You're reliving that which to you is past history, but you're reliving it minute by minute, day by day, and you can't get away from it until you realize that it is a flawed perception. Now let me move to another quite ordinary area while we're while we're making this tonight's tape. When city life gets established, and it begins, which will be very shortly, and it begins to develop the necessary progressive heavy industries, the very specific and exemplary enterprises that are synonymous with civilization. When this happens, I'll be a little more specific in a minute. When this happens, it always requires extensive capitalization. And you can always count on there being a collusion going on via exclusive franchising. I guess that's a mouthful enough to go back and straighten out for you. Now remember, if you can, that I'm either talking about a state out there or a state in here, or both of them, or neither one, or something else. But as a state, as a city-state develops, it will begin to require heavy industries. Such things, I say heavy industries, not maybe in the sense that they use it in undergraduate economics. It requires such things in the beginning and up until today. If you want to look at us as being an output of a 5,000 year process of a civilization line. It requires such things as mining. That is, the taking up of the elements, putting them into the form to make city life possible. It requires the production and transmission of energies, because you could not even imagine civilization now, city life, without electricity and the other forms. It also now requires dependable, readily available means of communication, since now information itself is a form of energy to keep city life moving. I guess that's enough to give you. That's about it. So for a city, now try real hard right quick, we're either talking about the actual development apparently out there of civilization, of all these people wandering in off the farms, living out in the deltas, living down in the swamps. They begin to talk, and they don't know why, but they begin to collect together, and they begin to form cities. And those of you who are good, forget all that. No, don't forget it, but simultaneously think about the whole nervous system, goes through this whole process. You begin to talk up here, and it begins to collect up diverse peoples, diverse thoughts, or else you don't have city life, else you're nothing. It begins to do that. Now let's pretend we're back talking about the actual external, physical city life. Very shortly, they can't just have these bucolic, these farmers, these berry pickers, these people that's been sucking on leather and mud to come slapping in just because they get together. That's not a city. Something else has got to happen. And what is necessary, they have to begin to develop technologies. They have to begin to manipulate the three-dimensional environment, or you can't even keep a city going. You just simply have a bunch of farmers, a bunch of berry pickers, then all in a mob in the one spot, but they might as well be back separate, because you don't have a city unless they begin to manipulate the environment, that they begin to build permanent structures to cover themselves, their families, to hoard food so they don't have to find food every day, day after day. Then very shortly after that, where you're thinking in a matter of seconds or thousands of years, it makes no difference because it's still going on, remember. They have to then begin to manipulate the environment all the way from protecting themselves and protecting their food to begin to manipulate even the temperature, the humidities, to make living indoors possible, which is city life. They have to be able to do that. So to do all that, they have got to take up mining. They have got to. And mining is the first place to get rich, because I assume all of you know this as soon as I tell you. All the stuff that they get out of mines comes out of the ground. You knew that. So, the first thing you do, if you're going to be rich, is some way you announce, I own this ground here. The ground from here over, you see where that fat guy is standing with the red hair? I own all this land. This ground is mine. Where you found that stuff that you want to use to build whatever it is you guys are building, I own that land. But no problem. Now, I'll let you have it. It's just everything you take out, I get, 30 kopecks per pound. But for every bucket load you get, just give me 30 kopecks and we'll call it even. It went from that to having to produce energy, because to keep city life going, they could not have humans out there picking up buckets of ore forever. City life would have never progressed. They had to have machines. They had to have that which would function at a more efficient energy rate than human labor. So then they had to produce energy, fossil fuels, steam, all of that. You're still talking about somebody being in charge. Now, the way it apparently works in city life is they do call it a franchise. Surely all of you know this. Again, it's not a history lesson, but I just make it quick to show you that out here is not out here. It's still in here. But they have always looked at, when I say they, the city life gets established, gets a foothold. The first thing they do is somebody takes charge. Somebody's dancing forward, some person, some group of people. And they will announce. Perhaps thousands of years ago they didn't explain. The king would just say, all right, here's the way it is, and the reason it's that way is because I say it is. But nowadays, under more, quote, civilized conditions, they like to point out such things as giving exclusive franchises to the production of energy and communications, which happen in the Western world, that states would either grant a franchise or take it upon themselves that, all right, there will only be one phone company. We can't have competition because this is too important, and we've got to have a standard system. We can't have a whole bunch of people going into the postal business of sending letters before fax machines. We can't do that. We can't have everybody deciding, well, I'm going to go in the electricity business. Me and my brother's going into it because old Fred and his brother down there, they started it, and we'll do it cheaper. He's making money, we'll do it. There'd be power lines running everywhere. So, as unfair as it may be, we've got to grant an exclusive franchise. We've got to turn the tape. All the things that are absolutely imperative for the health and growth of city life, all of those things are always of such a nature that life makes people. It's not just the people that do it. Life makes people say that these are so important. Land ownership, mineral rights was the first, and it still is, landlord rights. The privilege of producing energy and making it available for sale. The privilege of making communications possible, all the way from letter service, then the phone, or then Morse code telegraphs, then the phone, and then now fax machines, and all that entails. Although I know people say it, governments say it, they say, wait, this is so important, we cannot just throw it out in the free marketplace and just have every Tom, Dick, and Harry saying, hey, I'm going to turn out electricity. They might try to do it, but they might blow up some whole city somewhere. They might, if you plugged in their system, that might burn your house down. Plus, as I said, it's just logistically impossible. We cannot tolerate, city life would not tolerate phone lines from 100 different phone companies. So, as unfair as it is, say people, which is life, talking to them, we're going to have to cut out competition for the sake of everybody. But plus, they have pointed out this. Well, they don't like to normally, but the capitalization to set up, and it's just the way it is. Think about it a second. It's just obvious. You may not see any connection, but there is, or I wouldn't point out that which you might think is obvious. But of all of the kinds of enterprises in which a man might go, the ones I have mentioned that are of absolute inescapable necessity for city life, all of them, without exception, require staggering amounts of capitalization. You can open up a hot dog stand for, what? 150 copels. But to start producing, to open up mine, you do know you need more than a shovel. And of course, it's not just literal to open a mine, but to go into mining and everything that entails, to start producing steel during its time, was the horrendous capitalization undertaking. Then to start producing or to make the service available of communications, telephones, telegraph. It's not just the wire cost, but to start stringing wire across the whole country. You're not talking about some guy, Ray Kroc, trying to buy out a McDonald's brothers to open up a chain of hamburger stand. You're talking about a staggering kind of cost. All of it. Of those kinds of what I meant by the inescapable industries and enterprises, all of them require just astronomical capitalization. Now, surely no one's forgotten that you got to know that I'm not talking about Samuel B. Morris or Carnegie or U.S. Steel or Sprint. I'm not even talking about City Life, really, other than the fact that it still exists in your own genes. Consider now what life has done with and through man, the investment life has made in man, the absolute staggering amount of capitalization, that is the cost, the energy, the investment life has put into man, and it has operated unbeknownst to people. Well, they know it, but they don't know what to call it. They don't like to think about it. Life has exercised an exclusive franchise that's been going on. In man, the resource, the energy, the communication service, there has been an exclusive, an unrecognized exclusive franchise. Although I didn't lay on that, I was assuming, I guess by now, some of you put together what I was using as the elusive material springboard out here. That is, there's always, you can count on it, there's a kind of collusion going on apparently out here, in the world out there. That is, even if a government, there seems to be a free government somewhere, a free state, a pretty free city somewhere that says, all right, look, for us to go any further, we have got to have a steady supply of energy. Let's say it was electricity. And the people go, well, all right, we believe that. They just got a taste of electricity and lights and being able to work longer hours, for their benefit. And the people say, thank you, my king, thank you, President, that we now have lights so we can work at night. You never notice, because they say it's for your benefit. Same way as running rapid transit is for the workers' benefit, so you can get around to jobs easier. And I've already told you that you got it backwards. But at any rate, so let us say that people go, all right, we're listening, they say, all right, we're going to have a steady, reliable source of electricity, so that you can all someday have your own TV sets and your radios and can openers, and they'll go, great, great. So they say, all right, look, we're normally, me as your leader and all of my sub-leaders, we're all in favor of free enterprise and everybody getting a piece of the pie and blah, blah, blah. But look, there's going to have to be some exceptions. For one thing, to start producing electricity, let's assume that all of them had some idea what it is. To start producing it is going to cost 40 billion trillion kopecks. People can't even imagine it. So, nobody has that. Does any of you people listening out there have it? And of course, everybody. So he says, not only that, but even if you had the money, if 2 or 3 of you people out there, if you had that kind of financing, it would not be to the best interest of all of us to have just open competition of some guy over here producing electricity and some guy over here producing electricity. So we're going to have to, in some way, let some group of people just kind of get together and maybe form a non-profit corporation. Let's start out a squat city power and electrical company. And so the people always have gone along with it. That is, life knows what it's doing. There's always, if you could see it from a certain view, it would appear to be a collusion, because the power companies are not run by random strangers. When the power company got set up, you'll have to trust me, because life genes works in tandem. Life works very efficiently, genetically, the same way as you do, assuming that you're not a terminal klutz. The people who ended up owning and starting the power companies, the communication companies, those that were granted the franchise to begin to work the mines on public lands, they were granted franchises for 99 years, renewable to infinity. You'll have to trust me, the same way that genes work together. Pancreatic genes work very closely with liver genes. All your genes do what is necessary to get along to keep you going. those who ended up starting, owning, apparently capitalizing the power companies were not total strangers to the king. You just have to trust me. He did not just ask people off the street, anybody got the money, come in, and if I like the cut of your jib and your story, you can start a power company, or I'll let you go out and start the state-run or the state-backed, because they're doing it through taxes. I'll let you start producing the necessary steel to really get us going and everybody make a profit. He did not just open up the doors and say, everybody come in. Some clever kings here and there did that. But again, you'll have to take my word for it. The people that walked in off the street, they always came in second. The people who undertook, apparently, this huge financial capitalization and who ended up with a franchise were not strangers to the ruling powers. Back to you. Life has such a capital investment in what man is doing that it has, in effect, granted an exclusive franchise. And yet people, life still does it, of course, you've got to remember life can do all this simultaneously, has made people believe that it's a free market system. That you can think what you want to, you can do what you want to do, you can produce your own energy, you can try and mine and create your own, work your own materials and work it into something else, but there is an exclusive franchise going on. There's been a bit, I hate to tell you, of collusion going on. The grand old conspiracy theories, as I told you, the reason they exist out here and people believe it out there is because it's true. Oh, not out there, it's true in here. That's why people think something funny is going on. And they keep looking, life makes them go, where is it? Boy, I just know. There's some kind of collusion going on. There's a conspiracy here. And they all look. And they look under rocks. And they look under people's skirts. And they look behind rocks. The conspiracy, you don't have to look real far. I'll give you a hint. Look to the dialogue. But life has a huge investment in man. And anytime you find that kind of capitalization that's required, anytime you find that which is absolutely inescapable to keep some system operating, in this case I'm calling it the civilized city life of man, and there are things absolutely necessary if we're talking about city life out here. We're talking about being able to mine, rework the elements that are naturally here. You got to talk about the ability to create services of providing power, energy, and now communications. And these do not happen haphazardly out there. They do not happen by any appearance. Well, by some appearance. But they do not happen in a literal, in a true free market sense. It is always a matter of collusion. Do you understand why I even put it to you in this way? You people out on tape at some other time and some other place, try not to get choked on this, as far as I kept dragging it. Because literally, apparently talking about out there, although it's true, is not the point. But it is, if we were talking about simply out there, that if there was this little government, some aspect of life's own body that's running this state, this city, and it needs to keep growing. It absolutely needs, not a question of maybe, it needs mining, the production of heavy industries. It needs the production, the services, and the availability of steady energy, and it needs now communications. And it cannot leave it to chance. And it will always be a matter of collusion. It will always be a matter of conspiracy that the powers that be give it to their brother-in-law. Give it to somebody that's going to give kickbacks. Give it to their children. Give it to their yes men. But it's not going to be to strangers. It is not going to be to strangers on the basis that we don't know what they're going to do. Life operates the same way genetically in all of its operations. And it specifically, very specifically, operates that way inside of man. Because you are a growing city if you are at all truly involved with this kind of interest and activity. You are a continual growing city. Although I know you go back to the Dark Ages and then you come back. But you are, for all intents and purposes, a growing city. And you have got to have the heavy industries, I have mentioned. You have got to have the services and the investment, the cost it takes that life has invested in everybody, and then you look at it specifically in your case, is not going to be left to chance. It's collusion. You think you've been assigned your personality, your brain. Yeah, right. You think it was just kind of a bingo, or where was the environment? You know, how did I know what parents I'd get? How did I know my father would be a drunk? How did I know my mother would be a truck driver? How did I know that my mother would leave me? How did I know that I'd cut off my big toe when I was a kid? All of those things work together to produce me as I am. Right. Yeah, right. Yeah, the government decided, Thomas Edison did so much work, and we don't have time. The 20th century is now upon us, and we need good electricity. We need lights. It's for the benefit of everybody. So look, we'll work it out later, but right now, let him and his gang, let them produce all the electricity so we can get going, then we'll work it out later. Right, yeah. You got it. Did it just... Oh, it's just an accident. He would just happen to be there, right. Well, I'm just me, and it's just kind of an accident. Sure. Nobody's actually responsible. Yeah. Well, everybody's responsible a little bit, right. That's the same way of saying, well, wait a minute, it's not a complete conspiracy because people own shares, just ordinary people in AT&T, in Westinghouse, in U.S. Steel. So, I mean, it's obvious. There is some fairness. Right. You got it. Yeah. Plus, we can vote people out of office. If we don't like the president that told Edison that, all right, you take this over until further notice. If we don't like that, we'll vote that bastard out and put in somebody that's in favor of free market, that is, favor of accident, unpredictability. And so they vote out whoever it was, and they vote in, they don't know it, but they vote in his brother-in-law. Life is not going to commit hara-kiri through man. But part of what keeps man going is the feeling that, well, things could turn into suicide. At least things could be better, so we'll vote these rascals out and vote in somebody else. Plus, I'll buy some stock in Con Edison. And then if I don't like the way they're operating, I'll go to a shareholders meeting and I'll vote against what they're doing. Right. I'll teach them. There is an exclusive franchise going on inside of all of humanity. It is a conspiracy. It is a collusion going on. Of course, it's for the benefit of everybody, regardless of what the good old conspiracy theorists in the 3D world believe. But to see that is another step toward being able to stay out of the dark ages, at least more and more often. We're not going to pretend that that was the end of tonight's tape so I can do the other thing. See, no, just, I'm going to go off and off. All right, here we are, another night's taping. Here at the Fun Soupe Society. Oh, I already did that, all right. Here's what I was going to talk about that I had to wait. Maybe you'll see why. Let's start off first with a statement. Remember, this is your gift for the summer. You may not get another one until the fall. This may be the only one you'll ever need. And of course, it might be linguistically apropos, if not fortuitous, that I say it may be the only one you get before the fall. Fall does not simply mean autumn of the year. Opening statement for tonight's tape. A man, or a system, which of course is a man, that says he or they, the system, has some special knowledge, and it's based on a premise, then they got no knowledge. See, if I got enough reaction, I was just going, that'd be the end of tonight's tape and I'd leave. No offense. If there appears to be, from whatever source, the claim, let's put it on, the onus on apparently out there to start with. The claim is that they've got some special knowledge of some kind, and it's based on a premise. Such as, let's say, how about this for a premise? That ordinarily people can't change. How's that for a premise? Does that sound familiar? If the knowledge, whatever it's called, if it's based on a premise It ain't no knowledge. It's nothing. I want you to think about it again for a second. By premise, I mean just in the ordinary sense. You know what a premise is? A prior assertion upon which is based a succeeding argument or conclusion. Right? It is a prior assertion of which what is going to follow, the knowledge, the argument, the conclusion itself, is based upon. That's what a premise is. So I'm going to try it again for you. Any knowledge, I mean, call special knowledge, secret knowledge, important knowledge, more complex knowledge. If it's based on a premise, it ain't duck shit. It is not special knowledge. It's not extraordinary knowledge. It's just nothing. It's just everyday stuff. If it's based on a premise. Any premise. Any premise. Don't you want to think about it again? I'll pretend you do. Try. I'll pretend I'm drinking, I got some more coffee, and you pretend that you're going. So here we go. We'll pretend. Not only would real revolutionary, the real knowledge of an explorer, not only the knowledge, but a real explorer, him or herself, would not only transcend the apparent need for resistance in the world. Like knowledge always has to have its own resistance, right? We've been through that God knows how many times. Me pointing this out from about 17 different directions, that everything, no matter how well-meaning, no matter how potentially enlightening and informative it is, somebody's going to resist it, right? Now, I've even tried to point out to you that it has to be that way. But now, wait a minute. There's got to be something in addition to that, or you would never get anywhere. You'd stand there and do the dolly two-step, you and whoever you're dancing with, you and the information around and around and around. You look like one of those little ballet dancers on top of a cheap music box. So, a real, if we're going to speak about the person, a real explorer, or if we're going to talk about the knowledge itself, that flow of energy called knowledge, if it is going to be special, if it is something out of the ordinary, it not only has to get past this apparent barrier of there being resistance, it not only has to transcend that, it has to do something that you never even thought about that I just got through telling you for tonight's taping. It, moreover, has to have no apparent premise. Think about it one more time. All right. I guess then the bad part, the bad news, the dark ages, as I was speaking of last time we were taping. Without a premise, there would be no such thing even as ordinary knowledge. Without a premise, there would not be the operations of the intellect itself. Let's consider some kind of retreat away from the more complex city statement I started out with. So you thought I was going to say premise. So run back and take a small retreat for a second. Wait a minute, something's wrong here. Have to get off by yourself and think for a second. Wait a minute, if you didn't have a premise, you wouldn't have anything. I mean, you couldn't even think of anything. The intellect wouldn't even be talking, it wouldn't be working unless there was a premise, a prior assertion upon which is based succeeding arguments, conclusions. Without that, you wouldn't have any knowledge. Forget special knowledge for a minute. You wouldn't have any knowledge. You wouldn't even have an intellect operating that could perceive of knowledge, if it existed or not. But then imagine this. Let's rush back up and have a small renaissance for a second. Rush back up to the city. Try and imagine this. Only city people could do this. Hermits could not. But try and imagine this. Imagine a knowledge with no premise. Imagine a joke, the punchline, with no setup. Imagine a map with no key, no legend. Imagine a language with no first word. If part of your dialogue says that's impossible, don't listen. Let's flush back out in the woods a minute. If you get out there, you're back with old world intelligence, that's all you got. Got that old piece of leather you're still sucking on. If you get back out there and you think about it a second, as best you can think, you're faced with this. That without a premise, a man wouldn't have any questions of any type, especially serious, special questions, but he wouldn't have any questions. Without a premise, you couldn't have any doubts. You couldn't have any confusion. And we're talking about the very kinds of things that you've got to have for city life. You could not have either or situations without a premise. You could never have any conclusion. Couldn't even have the appearance of a period. How can you have a conclusion without a premise? I mean, if you just say something, it's not a conclusion. I'm being a little tricky because I know a lot of you think you hadn't gotten it yet. And I'll bet you I'm going to make you got it in just a few minutes. You may not like gotten it right at that moment, but you'll get over it. Rather than it sounding as though I'm continuing to talk about fairly cortical matters of knowledge and thought and language, let's take what would appear to be less stringently intellectual affairs into realms that heretofore were referred to as spiritual. Do you realize that according to mankind, according to all men, all gods have a premise? Now, if we will take my opening statement in tonight's taping, I told you that anything, system, person, any source that claims to have some kind of special, out of the ordinary knowledge, and it's based on a premise, has no such knowledge. Now, I did not say with the exception of gods, because there are no exceptions. But according to men everywhere on this planet, no matter what they were called, gods in the plural and the singular with small g's, big G's, there is no such thing, according to men, of a God anywhere at any time without a premise. Are there any religions without a premise? If there is no premise, why would anybody want to change? Why would there be any possibility that someone might convert to something, to adopt some way of thinking or behaving? Because there's got to be a premise. What's the general premise in life? All right, I'll retract for a second and give you some breathing room. according to the institutions of life, according to the religions of life, even the thinkers of life, but according to the general institutions, the civilized institutions of humanity, what is the initial, the basic, the inescapable premise of human existence? That something is yet to be done, that things have got to change, that people have got to change, that you individually have got to change. That is the premise. Religions just have it narrowed down fairly specifically. Feelings of nationalism, the institutions of nationalism, family, race, culture, and all that are just variations of this, but the religions, the premise is, they look at you and they say, you're obviously not one of us, right? You're obviously not a blank, a Jew or Christian, whatever. And you go, no. They state immediately, if you didn't already know it, the premise. The premise is, if you are not a blank, you're in trouble. If you do not do so and so, you're going to pay for it. The premise is always that which is necessary for you to follow, that is, for you to be an energized part of, for you to be a unit in this energy flow. From then on, there has to be a premise, because you don't belong in every energy flow. You could be wired up in such a way that the premise could be, everyone needs to be a Baptist or you will die and burn up forever with rats in your underwear. And you might be wired up in such a way that you walk past and you don't even hear stuff like that. You're not antagonistic, you don't resist it. It's just not one of the premises that you're wired up to react to. You might walk on down the street and there's a premise. Right outside the store here, a guy is hawking out, sale on toilet paper. There will be a shortage coming up, you better get it now. That may be the kind of premise, as small as it may seem, to which you are wired up to react. And you may rush in and participate. You may become a part of the conclusion of that premise. That the premise in the conclusion being, anybody who's smart, anybody who's intelligent will come in now and get it while it's on sale, before there's a scarcity. The religions, though, exemplify, if you can hear what I'm pointing towards, the premise that things have got to be other than they are. What is all so-called knowledge? And I start off saying special knowledge. If that still seems too elusive, why would you go to school past the point that you were forced to go? Why would you go and further your education? It's on the premise. The premise in this case is not punishment, that you'll die and burn up with rats in your underwear forever, or that you'll be sans toilet paper, or else it'll be costing 750 copals a roll if you don't do it now. Instead of the threats, the promise. If I get my degree in sewerage, I'll be a better person. I'll be happier. I'll be richer. I may even be famous. Without that premise, why would you pursue education? That is, just even ordinary knowledge. That which is eluding most of you sitting here, in case you want to figure later why life has made it elude you, is no matter what example I come up with, religion, college, no matter what it is, it's all got a premise. You have to take some prior assertion. And we don't begin to have time, and you don't begin to have the recepting mechanisms for me to talk about how can there be a prior assumption to everything. You have to think about the great saddle sore. That spherical saddle, for those of you that missed the joke. There is a prior assumption that is a premise to everything that follows. It doesn't matter where you start. It doesn't matter whether you turn the dictionary and you decide the first word in the dictionary is not A, letter A. You can decide, being the arbitrary, independent person you are, that you can turn and say the first letter in the dictionary is X, the letter X, and you can start there. You can do anything you want to. You can say that that is the first letter. That is the first word. You can say that, but there was an assumption made before. There was a premise before that. You cannot go back to a point that there are no premises. There is a prior assertion upon which everything is based that's coming after that. And nobody can see it. Because at the ordinary level, you can't see it. It's a premise within itself. And what people cannot see, and I was inferring in a somewhat facetious manner that you don't want to see it, is when I started out tonight's taping, this pretend part, that anybody, any system, any source that says we've got some special knowledge and it's based on a premise, they got no special knowledge. And I gave you a prime example. I thought some of you'd really like it and your faces would really light up. Just a premise that people can't change. Life is as it is. That's the premise. Now let's go from there. There ain't nowhere to go from there. If what you know is based on a premise, you don't know nothing. You notice you're not liking it anymore the more I go over it. Things would not, if I was going to use what would appear to be a more straightforward psychological kind of clothing to this energy, to put some mass on this energy. Just note, without a premise, there would be no tenable threats, no promises, whether they be of spiritual, intellectual, financial, social nature. There would be no position that would be defensible, that would be usable, that would have any effect on people's nervous system as they are arranged, unless there was a premise, a prior assertion that this is based upon that which will either punish or reward you in some way. That's it. But there is that premise. You just take it as being a given. You just take it as being self-evident or obvious. As long as I mention religions, and I was talking about such things, on less than the kind of large institutional level, what's normally referred to as cults, that is outside the mainstream, outside the bell curve of what goes on in life, and it seems to be one single person had started something, this secret, some kind of special knowledge that they had. Just what I mean the ordinary people call a cult. It is based upon a premise, always. It's a cute one that most people don't notice. The premise upon which it's based is the founder's fears. So wherever you look, you find a cult somewhere. Maybe you didn't want to call it a cult, something you'd been involved with in the past. You may even imagine that this was, and that I would surely end up being. All cults, it got some premise. It's almost like a little smorgasbord. You look around, you can find one that you seem to like their premise. Premise of some group can be, and the leader, the founder could be dead now. It could be 100, 1,000 years ago. But the premise will be, you'll find out the premise is that, let's say that men are basically hostile, but we can help you through it. That's the premise. The unrecognized premise is that that was the fear of whoever founded it. It was the fear, if that doesn't explain enough, it was the nemesis, the unbeatable foe. That was what the founder was wired up to apparently be in an Apache dance with, and he never could overcome it. And he can't explain it, he can't begin to, but it comes out that that is the premise of the cult. That is the premise of the system. That, well, we're all helpless, would be one. We're all just machines. We should all be more loving. All he's saying, if it's a premise, that this knowledge is based on a premise, which all of it is, the premise he's telling you is what he can't deal with. Which is no shortfall on his part. It's not some psychological flaw. Life needs this. A cult's not something to be stamped out. Life needs cults. They just don't need them. They don't have to be as heavily capitalized as AT&T. And they're easier to replace than it is to, regardless of what the government did to AT&T, for AT&T, but it's a lot harder. It's less cost efficient to break up a good exclusive monopoly, franchise, or something like AT&T than it is to take some cult or some religion here and there and send it to the winds and produce a new one. But you have a premise. If you find anything that's got a premise, you hadn't found anything. Now, don't leave everybody being too concerned. Oh, sure I do. I don't care. If you're too concerned, shame on you. But you do. You sense, if I'm going to wrap up tonight in any way that sounds like a wrapping up, you do sense that this kind of activity, whatever this is, with no name and not much of anything, except a few laughs. When this kind of thing is operating at optimum velocity, it's really premiseless. 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 Offering up no thoughts, no threats, no promises, no, well, what I was going to say is no thought pictures of success or failure, and certainly no conclusions. And yet, every time, not only it's just I'm aware of it, and I keep trying to jog you, because verbally we can't take the three-dimensional sounds of which you're essentially capable of receiving and make this a continuing self-evident reality. But even when I'm talking, it sounds like a premise. So I start off, whatever the night is or whatever the sentence is, that's the way the 3D world is. It sounds like a premise. And me saying, well, history records the Dark Ages as being so-and-so. Well, there's a premise. The premise already tacitly going to be that, all right, they don't have it right, and I'm going to tell you what really happened. If that indeed was the extent of it, then anything I told you was just meaningless. It might have been cute, it might have been as interesting as reading a history book, it might have been anything, but it was not anything special. Now, if that be true, then what are you left with the ordinary operations of your own intellect, your own nervous system? And you do not take it into account. That's part of the trickery that I tried to exert on you. Well, I even telling you in advance and along the way. And those of you that have had the proper experiences, those little times of silliness and cuteness, the operations of the nervous system then were operating in such a way that you were almost premiseless. That there was no prior assertion upon that which followed in your thoughts, upon that which it was based. Because if there was a prior assumption, you drug it in from the old country. You brought it in from the woods and the bogs. You brought it in from the city. Now we're talking about the old city. You brought it with you. And we're trying to, you don't know it, but I'm trying to fumigate your Nina and your Pinta and your Santa Marie. So that when you get to the new world, you don't have all these bugs in your computer, all these viruses in your limbic, in your motor systems, and all these little bacteria cluttering up your brain, which all it can be wrapped up in one word: premise. Let me say it again, because I wanted to leave it just with my opening statement. Anything that purports to be, you notice I didn't make me an exception, I didn't make us an exception, I didn't make this an exception, if this is indeed a this, whatever this is. And you shouldn't say it's whatever this is. You shouldn't even say that, of course. That's why I tell you it's not. It's not even this, but We don't want to play Zen square dance, I know. But my opening statement, I told you, I told it as good as it can be told, at least this summer. As good as you can hear it. And I may have overestimated that, but never mind. Anything that purports to be special knowledge, whatever you consider that to be, that's what you're after by coming here, seeing these tapes. Anything that purports to be special knowledge and is based on a premise is no special knowledge. And me dragging it out, now you should see the point is, anything you can hear about, anything that you've ever heard about, was based on a premise. Except this when it is operating right, and if you're just stuck with your ordinary sensual intake, the best I can make it operate right is to say, all right, everything's based on a premise, except the premise of this is, there ain't no premise. And you go, oh, Jesus. You think it is Zen, do-si-do. There's a place where there is no premise. But here ain't it. I don't mean here in this room or here where you're seeing that tape. Wherever you are and hearing this, and that's all you hear, then here ain't it. Wherever your here is. If it's got a premise, it's wrong, it's faulty, it's misleading, it's just right. It's that which is absolutely necessary for ordinary functions. But remember, if it's got a premise, it's not it. And so I got to tell you, again, we're running out of time. This has got no premise. I know if I was having to do some thumbnail sketch or trying to hold myself out as some kind of new guru or this kind of activity, some new salvation of the world, to be a salvation of the world, the premise is the world needs saving. But for me to just suddenly come on, me or anybody, but let's say it's me since I'm the one doing the talking, and I say, well, I was advertised, you heard about it, all right, and you wanted to hear me talk, all right, here I am. There's already a premise. That is that you need to hear it. You'll suffer if you don't hear it. You'll be better off if you do hear it. That's the premise. That ain't the premise. Or some of you could have thought that you have already extrapolated for yourself that the premise of this is that ordinary life is pretty mechanical and that there's some way to get beyond it. Or the ordinary development of the nervous system only goes up to some point and that's all free life needs you. But this will help you get otherwise. You would say, well, that's the premise. It's fair, it's reasonable, and as far as you're concerned, I did not turn it into an ego trip, so it's a reasonable premise. There ain't no reasonable premise. All premises stink. They all smell. They're all distracting. They're all necessary. But if you think this has got a premise, you are wrong. But that can't be. I know. But look at it this way. If I am correct, for a glimpse, you ought to at least see again why this will never, ever be popular or famous. As they like to say in Italy, no way, Jose. And since some of you are already out of tape and not hearing this, I'll say we're out of tape and that you're not hearing this.